honor, really, to introduce one of the great sages of Vedic science and modern science of our times, the Dean of the Maharishi College of Perfect Health, and also the Director of the Institute of Natural Medicine and Health, Dr. Robert Schneider.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone in the Governor's Workshop. Tonight, we're going to be talking about epigenetics, the new science of epigenetics and consciousness. Modern science discovers how to manage your biological destiny. Next slide. Or, as Time magazine says, why your DNA isn't your destiny. Next slide. Here's the point of view from the unified field perspective on physiology and modern medicine. Contemporary medicine functions on these more relative levels. Here are the organs and the organ systems, and this is more like surgery and the mechanical level of medicine. And then this gets to the level of the cells, and then the biochemicals are here. And this is more like pharmacology, drugs that work on the level of receptors on the membranes of cells. And over the years, modern medicine has gotten more and more subtle in its own way. And now the new field of medicine, the frontier of medicine, is the level of the gene, genome, or DNA. DNA contains all the intelligence in the entire physiology. And modern medicine is attempting to decode the human genome, to decode the DNA, to determine what's going to happen when in a person's physiology and health. So this is the field of genetic medicine or genomic medicine. And then below that is the field of quantum mechanical medicine and unified field-based medicine, which is Maharishi Ayurveda. But here we're going to talk about this frontier of modern medicine and how it corresponds with our field of yoga, or Maharishi Ayurveda. In the next slide, please. This is the central dogma of modern medicine. Even modern science has its own religion, and they call it the central dogma. And from this point of view of genomic medicine, which is the frontier of modern medicine, the world looks like this. First, there's DNA, which we just saw a minute ago, which contains the blueprint for the whole physiology. And that's transcribed or gives its information over to RNA. RNA is another molecule that goes out from the inside of the cell where the DNA is to the outer portion of the cell and delivers its information. And then RNA is decoded in the outer part of the cell or translated by different parts of the cell. And that leads to proteins. And proteins form the building blocks for the rest of the body. And then those building blocks build other building blocks, which make all the other chemicals in the body. So here's the central dogma that's been up until now. The religion of modern science, modern medicine, DNA goes to RNA, it goes to protein, and that's fixed. You were born with your DNA, and that's it. You're stuck with it. That's your karma, in a sense. However, as the next slide shows, the new field of epigenetics shows that this is not as fixed as we thought. Our destiny is not as fixed as we had thought. This field, and let me show you how. This is the DNA, and DNA is wrapped around itself in a helix, a double helix, and this coil of DNA is called chromatin. And the chromatin, in a microscope, clumps into these X-like structures, and that's called a chromosome. But the chromosome is made up of this chromatin, and there's DNA inside of it. But around these coils of DNA are proteins, proteins called histones. And what is the latest discovery in modern genomic medicine is that these proteins control how the DNA is expressed. A gene means a portion of the DNA that regulates a certain protein or certain body part. And if this protein unwinds, that opens up or exposes a part of the DNA to express itself. But if that protein closes up, then that part of the DNA is covered or blocked or hidden, if you will. There's also another epigenetic mechanism called DNA methylation. That just means there's a chemical, there's a molecule that binds to the DNA. And when that molecule binds to the DNA, it can either turn it on or turn it off. So here we have entirely new mechanisms to control the expression of biological intelligence, if you will. And these mechanisms, called epigenetic mechanisms, have been related or have shown to be influenced by chemicals in our environment, by drugs, by aging itself, even by components of the diet. So our environment actually affects what parts of the DNA get turned on and what parts of the DNA get turned off by these biochemical mechanisms. And changes in these DNA, in these epigenetic mechanisms, have been shown to be associated with cancer, autoimmune diseases, mental disorders, diabetes, and other conditions. So it can affect your health very dramatically. Next slide. This slide shows a lot of genes, a lot of parts of the DNA that have been shown to be affected by epigenetic mechanisms that are affected by lifestyle. Other studies have shown that changes in diet and exercise and health habits can turn on or off a whole lot of genes and therefore affect your health, mental health and physical health. Next slide. And there's a certain part of the gene which is particularly important for tonight's discussion and particularly important for your aging and well-being, and it's called a telomere. A telomere is the end of the chromosome. Remember that X-like structure we looked earlier, that chromosome? The very tip of it, like the tip of your shoelace, is called the telomere. It's a cap, and it controls much of the chromosome and much of the DNA in it. And this is a microscopic picture of these X-like chromosome structures, more or less. And then the tips are stained in yellow. And those are the shoelace tips that very much control the DNA. And in the next slide, we see are associated with aging and health. This slide shows that as we get older, the length of those tips, or length of those telomeres, gets shorter. And when those telomeres get shorter over age, they're able to protect the chromosome less. And then the chromosome gets damaged, and then all kinds of disorders come in, and disorders associated with aging. So this protective mechanism is lost commonly with aging. And then what protects the telomeres? What repairs the telomeres is an enzyme called telomerase, and that causes it to maintain its full function. And if telomerase is low, the telomeres are low, and then aging and disorder are high. And the reason why this is all important is shown in the next slide, because our group at the Center for Natural Medicine and Prevention here at MUM, led by a graduate student, Shanti Lakshman, in collaboration with Genetic ID, Dr. John Fagan, and sponsored by the National Institutes of Health, conducted a study to look at the effects of transcendental meditation on telomerase. That means effectively on the telomere, which means effectively on DNA function, which is, I just showed you how important that is. And in this study, which was in a group of hypertensive individuals in Howard University in Washington, D.C., half the subjects learned transcendental meditation and got a basic course, a simple course in health education for a healthy lifestyle. The second group, who was randomized, got an intensive or extensive health education program, because we saw in the earlier slide that lifestyle modification actually can change telomeres in the genes. So that was the control. And then we measured, this is HTR, which means one of the genes that controls telomerase. And what we found, we essentially replicated the earlier work by others. This is before and after. That lifestyle modification can change this gene and can change telomerase. This is transcendental meditation, and with the basic lifestyle program, a much simple program, but largely transcendental meditation. And this group started lower than this group just before they did anything, but they went up the same percent amount as the extensive lifestyle modification group. Next slide, please. And then there's a second gene that controls telomerase, that controls telomeres, that controls the DNA, and this is called HTERT. And we found a very similar result. In this case, the group started about the same, and the change was about the same. These people changed their diet, they exercised a whole lot, they did a lot of dramatic things in their lifestyle. This group had the expensive bed that Maharshi just talked about, or couch or chair, largely, with some basic education. And through their consciousness primarily, they were able to change their genes. And changing your genes, in this case, is in the direction opposite to aging, slowing the aging process on the level of DNA. Next slide, please. So this is a summary of the old view of our destiny as it relates to the blueprint in our physiology, in the DNA, the primacy of DNA. This is the central dogma. We've got that template inside of us, RNA protein. Our life is fixed biologically, even in terms of behavior, because so much of behavior is regulated by DNA influences. However, in the next slide, it demonstrates, in our next slide, there should be, if you can go back one more, and then just hit it one more time. All right, let's just go forward. So anyway, the new science is that there's a series of regulatory proteins called epigenetics, and these regulatory proteins supersede or influence or modify the genetic blueprint. That means through our free will, through our choice of behavior, through our choice of environmental influences, through our choice to transcend and gain that state of restful alertness, we can influence this expression of intelligence in our biology. Next slide, please. All right. We should do some epigenetic influences on the slides. So it really does move forward. If someone is, this is the primacy of the environment. This is what I was talking about. That the environment, or what we do with our consciousness, the environment of our DNA within our consciousness, is primary. Next slide, please. Now, according to Time magazine, modern science has discovered God in our genes. And I think we can say from the Vedic point of view that yes, everyone has this spiritual level, this potential for enlightenment in their DNA, only it's up to us how we unfold it by managing our environment and managing our consciousness. Thank you. Jai Gurudev.